Okay, friends and colleagues, good morning. Bonjour à tous. We are very, very honored today to have Professor Brossat, Alain Brossat with us. And let me just first briefly introduce Professor Brossat to you, even though I think he's very well known and people in Taiwan probably, very few in Taiwan don't know him. Yeah. But, you know, this is a formality which you have to go through. Professor Alain Brossat is a professor emeritus from Paris 8 University, and he was Yushan J scholar at Jiaotong University, Yangyi Jiaotong, and is currently a distinguished professor, researcher at the International Center for Cultural Studies at Yangyi Jiaotong University, and also J scholar at Chenggong Dashi and Chenggong University. His main research interest lies in contemporary French philosophy, with a focus on how to rethink and reinvent democracy, and delving especially into the issue of subjectivity of the immigrants, of the subordinate and lower classes of the society. And he's also devoted to how to decolonize cultural and culture as well as knowledge formation. And his work has been many, those which have been translated into Chinese are Foucault, 危险哲学家, Foucault, The Dangerous Philosophy, 2013, and 错开的交汇, Foucault 与中国, Foucault in China, 2019, as well as 遭重翻的哲学家, 哲学评论集 2021, sorry. And he's going to be speaking today on the topic of the dead end of bilingualism, 双语政策的死胡同. Now this presumably should be a highly controversial and contested issue, but strangely, people seem to have taken it for granted that we are really marching toward a bilingual state sooner or later. Sooner or later we'll reach that goal. I personally have written some, short comments on this topic and actually debated with some scholars. But in the last couple of years, when the government decided to actually proceed with this policy, it seems that it has to be thoroughly discussed in the academia, in the public sector, but actually in most areas we don't see much debate. It is really a pity, and actually it's a dangerous move for the society as a whole, I think, especially in terms of creativity and ability to think. So we thank Professor Brossat for generously agreeing to give us this talk, and I hope this will stir up some discussion later on. Now, Professor Brossat, let's welcome him.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Okay, so let me begin with that. As you see, it's in French. It's actually it's for fun. It's an advertisement for, let's say, a series of books for learning foreign languages by oneself, without teacher. So in, let's say, 50 lessons, you know Italian well enough for traveling through Italy, ordering a meal in a restaurant, etc., etc. And it says, so you see he's a beggar. The cartoonist is very famous in the French realm, Ciné. He passed away a few years ago, but he was quite famous, one of the most famous cartoonists in France. And it says, pity for a poor man who speaks only one language, and don't stay or remain plagued by infirmity, don't be handicapped by the fact of speaking only one language. So this is our subject, right? Okay, so now I can pass to my talk. Yes, of course, the title is a bit provocative, but it's on purpose. So yes, I go straight to the point by quoting an article from recent articles, so published March, two articles, published in March and April this year in Taipei Times. I read Taipei Times every day since I'm not able to read in Chinese. So this is my main source for information on what's happening in this country. I read it, it's an obligation for me because it is my source, but I don't like it at all. And this is why I call it in my paper more or less the Pravda in English of the people who are ruling this country, or the Pravda of the ruling elite today in Taiwan. So, Taipei Times in March and April this year has published two editorials on what they call bilingualism. And the funny thing is that these two editorials were openly and rather harshly conflicting and contradicting each other, which is not very usual in this daily paper. But I think it's a symptom. It shows how sensitive, how contentious this issue can be in Taiwan today. So the first, I have to sum up a bit what the two conflicting texts editors say. The first article, translated from Chinese, that is from the daily paper Liberty Times, published in Chinese, was called Bilingualism Needs Broad Effort. You have the date in the paper. The second article, which emanates very probably from the English-speaking and partly international American staff of the paper, was entitled Rural Action, Best Language Policy. And the second paper appears very distinctly as a direct answer to the former, or more precisely, a vehement and rather sarcastic refutations by the mavericks of Taipei Times of the official statement issued by the, let's say, bureaucrats of the Liberty Times. This is how it looks like, I think. So anyway, reading both texts, one could see that there was some sort of a wound which was open and bleeding on bilingualism. So, what are the terms of the discussion as set up in this brawl, in this row? For those who voice the official position in Liberty Times, bilingualism is some sort of a code word that means that the Taiwanese people should achieve what I would call, in reference to the pandemic, herd proficiency in English within the coming decade or decades, I don't know exactly. The people in Taiwan should become massively fluent in English, like, let's say, the Dutch, the Israelis, the Swedes, or as well the people in Singapore. They should, because, I quote, for Swedes or as well the people in Singapore, for more than a century, English has been the lingua franca of international business and commerce, as well as migration and cultural exchange. So, I don't want to argue about the solidity of this statement that is for more than 1 century. I'm not sure about that. It's quite disputable, but I would like to focus on, let's say, the pragmatic tone and open orientation of these statements towards business before all. A few lines before, the article makes things quite clear, saying, I quote again, Taiwan does not offer an all-English environment, which makes it hard to attract international banks to move their headquarters here. That is meaning in the context of the article from Hong Kong, moving from Hong Kong to Taiwan, of course. And it continues, quote again, financial hubs must provide a full range of services entirely in English. Therefore, the capital that left Hong Kong in the wake of China's repression in the territory has moved to Singapore, Tokyo, and London, not to Taipei. I must say that this statement puts things rather bluntly. English is needed, bilingualism is needed in Taiwan because the capital with capital speaks English. The capital speaks English. If the island aspires to become a financial hub in East Asia by taking advantage of the new situation in Hong Kong, it has to become entirely English-friendly at all levels in social life, and the golden boys of the stock markets from all around the world have to be provided with services in English anytime, any place they go, and they have to feel at home in Taiwan. Whence, for us here in the academic space, two preliminary questions. First, is the general question of bilingualism reducible to that of massive fluency in English in a country where it is not the mother tongue of the, let's say, natives? Second, as this notion of bilingualism to be primarily business, economy, market-oriented. It cannot be taken for granted that we need to accept it, that we have to accept these premises. And, okay, I'll go back over to this issue later in my talk. Then, coming to more concrete matters, the article mentions, I quote, the blueprint for developing Taiwan into a bilingual nation by 2030, promoted a few years ago by the then Prime Minister William Lai. In brief, this program, consisting in, I quote, stipulating 2019 as year zero for bilingualism, aimed at ensuring that all students in the first grade of elementary school would achieve internationally competitive ability in English after 12 years of education, end quote. Which means, to put things simply, that the new generation would pass from the condition of more or less, let's say, passable and passive readers in English to that of active speakers, able to move on easily in an English-speaking environment in Taiwan and abroad, a goal or an horizon that appears to be, let's say, quite remote and maybe hazy today. Rejecting the argument of those who try to politicize the linguistic issue by insinuating that this project would be inspired by, I quote, the cult of Anglo-American hegemony, and promote softly Taiwanese independence. The article goes one step further. Taiwan, it says, quotes, must stop giving importance to Mandarin as its single national language, a statement which, in this context, appears to be more de-Sinisation-oriented than inspired by the care for local languages like Hoklo, Hakka, Aboriginal idioms, etc. The innuendo here is distinctly that English too should become a national language. That is, the second official language of the state and of the nation that goes with that state. The final paragraph of the text makes this point perfectly clear. Quote, schools, companies, and families can help broaden people's horizons and help them develop their abilities. This, in turn, would help Taiwan's integration in the national community based on its strength as a maritime nation, end quote. The political background of this statement is quite clearly designed here. If we, Taiwanese, want Taiwan, our island, to become a maritime nation rather than a part of China or a Chinese province, if we want it to be acknowledged and recognized as a sovereign entity, not to mention the explosive I word, independence, we have to accommodate, we have to adopt English, whatever it might cost in time, money, and before all in terms of change of our linguistic habits and preferences. We have to graft, we have to transplant English in, on our minds and within our throats. For it is an absolute requirement for us, Taiwanese, if we want to emancipate ourselves politically and culturally from the mainland. The editorial published a month later in Taipei Times takes the exact opposite stand to the former. Here is its opening, quote, the Ministry of Education last week said it was planning to hire 300 foreign teachers as the government aims to bring widespread English language fluency in Taiwan by 2030. Horizon 2030, as set by the people in charge for Taiwan, to have reached, let's say, the enchanted shores of bilingualism. I must say that for me as a European, it has, this project has some sort of a whiff of grand projet in socialist countries, formerly in Eastern Europe, like at the time of the forced march industrialization in the Soviet Union under Stalin's Iron Fist. And then the article continues in a rather exasperated tone. However, the 460 millions Taiwanese of tax money that it plans to spend annually might be better spent on infrastructure and equipment at rural schools. So the critical tone is here quite open and clear. How much, it continues, how much could the government achieve with 381 foreign teachers, including the 81 already employed in public school system? Question mark. In other terms, this huge project, if we follow what is said here, this huge project, it is just for the show. It's pure waste of money. But the author of this counter-attack goes a step further, saying that bilingualism is not something you can achieve by decree. You cannot achieve it by decree. It has to be rooted in everyday life and in long-term practice. I quote, "Most people become fluent in a language either because it is what they speak at home or because they use it throughout grade school. That is why students at international schools are fluent in English, even though they might speak Chinese at home," end quote. In other words, the condition for children to become really fluent in English in Taiwan would be that English had been made the language of instruction for all subjects in public schools. I quote again, "even though they might speak Chinese at home." This might, at this place, is rather funny, for what does the overwhelming majority of children speak at home on this island, if not Chinese, any kind of Chinese? But this is not here, I think, the crucial issue. What the editorial writer advisedly stresses is that for obvious reasons, English cannot be made the language of instruction for all subjects in Taiwan. This in spite of the extreme voluntarism of the promoters of this bilingualism mantra, or big project. As the author, he or she, the author of the text knows, the focus exclusively on English has something dubious and suspect in itself. After all, Taiwan has already several official languages, including Taiwanese, Hokklo, and Hakka. These became official languages to accommodate sizable populations of speakers, end quote. In other terms, what causes, what makes that a language has to be made official, that is acknowledged and recognized by the state, the authority, as legitimate, is the fact that sizable groups of people use it as their common language. That is, if you take things from that angle, the impulse has to come from below, or at least from the acknowledgement of what the landscape of the linguistic diversity is in a given country, which is completely different from what the promoters of the Grand Projet have in mind. That is the projection of English as a global idiom or vehicle, basically alien to the cultural and linguistic identity of the overwhelming majority of the speakers in Taiwan, the projection of this language onto the population of the island. In this project, the impulse comes entirely from above, that is from the government, from the elites, and from the state. And this is where the journalist in the second paper hammers the nail, saying, I quote, Canada recognizes French as an official language, given the large population of French speakers in Quebec and elsewhere. Other countries, such as Singapore and Switzerland, recognize multiple languages for the same reason. With English, Taiwan is approaching the situation backward, aiming to recognize an official language for which there is no sizable population of native speakers, and then pushing to create such a population. It is, I must say, a rather devastating and definitive critique. And the funny thing, if you think about it, is that everything is completely upside down in this debate, and it makes it rather, I would say, burlesque. Because the article that promotes the collective graft of English into the Taiwanese brains has been written originally in Mandarin and only then translated into English. The article that retorts sharply that things are not that simple is written in English, or rather in American, which is a variety of English, probably, very probably, by a native English speaker. So the strangeness of this configuration shows, I think, how complicated, to say the least, things are in this discussion. What the article suggests, the second article suggests, without putting it directly or bluntly, is this. In the religion, in the cult of English, which the present administration is promoting, that is the idea that a majority of the population should be fluent in English, there is much more than a pragmatic idea that basic pragmatic cliché, that English has become the Esperanto of global economy. There is more than the simple association of proficiency in English with economic competitiveness. And this little something more is not related basically to economics, but to politics. The idea being that the adoption of English as the second official language in Taiwan is what would best testify to the fact that the island's fate is inseparable from the West, more precisely from the US, you know, the mantra of the rock-solid alliance, blah, 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 blah. Or put more explicitly, English as a token of subalternity in this context. Subalternity, that is what makes that, okay, the people who are ruling this country today assume their status as proxies, subordinates, who have to speak the master's idiom. It's always like that. The subordinate, the proxies, speak the master's language, not the other way round. Since for political reasons, the author of the text cannot put it in Taipei Times, cannot put it as bluntly as this, and cannot go straight to the heart, to the political heart of the problem, he or she has to resort to the soft economic argument. English is not necessarily the royal path to or for economic success. I quote, for example, Japan is the third largest economy in the world, but English is rarely spoken in official or business contexts there. in Japan. In short, what becomes visible in the reverse angle the second text puts forward is this. Bilingualism, as it is intended and understood by its promoters in the present context in Taiwan, is a political or ideological fantasy. It's a symptom more than a realistic project. It's some sort of an exhibition of vassalage, extreme, excessive, and rather vulgar. Let's forget about it and go back to reality. The article exalts, this is the tone of the article, and reality, which is made of simple and very tangible things. I quote, "The ministry should use the money to put computers, internet connections, telescopes, laboratories, musical and sport equipment, and other tools into the hands of students in rural areas so that they can acquire truly useful skills." Truly useful skills, supposing that English is not a truly useful skill. So being fluent in English is not one of these truly useful skills. If you live in a small town, people, mostly by Hakka people, or an Aboriginal village in the mountains of Hsinchu County. I say Hsinchu County because I wrote this text as I was still in Hsinchu. Okay, so now let me pass to, let's say, a broader approach of this issue. Bilingualism, or more generally, our ability to speak, to read, to think in other languages than our mother tongue, it's, of course, a very serious matter. It is too serious to be reduced to the dimension of, let's say, linguistic diplomacy, or to be diverted or hijacked for political purposes, what, of course, the instigators of this campaign for bilingualism are distinctly doing. One last evidence for that, and this is from another article which was published in March in Taipei Times, is, okay, a text which says that, I quote, "Exchanges between Taiwan and the US on bilingual education support Washington policy of limiting Chinese influence in the US, as well as Taiwan's goal of becoming a bilingual nation by 2030. American Institute in Taiwan, IAT, Director Brent Christensen said at the Bilingual Education Symposium at Kaohsiung's National Sun Yat-sen University yesterday. So it puts things rather clearly. The political bias in this campaign sticks out a mile in this statement by the US proconsul in Taipei, as well as it is crystal clear that those who push for it in the high spheres of the central administration here in Taiwan think and act in this context as, let's say, clients as in ancient Rome, clients in Latin, clients of the US administration, clientelism being some sort of an institution that is an institutionalized form of subalternity. What we should think about, I think, and problematize by contrast with this utilitarian approach of bilingualism is the very fact that English today, for those who have to use it as a means of linguistic communication in the context of globalization, which happens to be also the context of a rising new Cold War, English always is, before all, a bone of contention. For it is, of course, the new lingua franca, which we need as such, not only when we have to talk with native English speakers who don't speak our mother tongue, but more than that, and I would say more interesting than that, a language we need for transversal cross-exchanges with people with whom English is the only way and the most practical way to exchange and communicate. When I speak with international students from the Philippines, from Vietnam, from Malaysia, Indonesia, but as well sometimes from Sweden or Poland, I have to do it in English. And in this configuration, English is, if not exactly a blessing, still it is a rather convenient tool because it's easier to speak passable international English than, for example, very correct French or German, or I imagine a fortiori Chinese. But with all this, we should never forget that English also is also not only a colonial language, the language of a former colonial empire, as other idioms like French or Spanish, but today the language of hegemony, both political, the US and its English-speaking followers, and cultural, American way of life, Anglo-Saxon liberalism, and all its set of values. In terms of behaviors and conducts, or as well of subjectivity, people who are not native English speakers and still need English for many purposes, have to work hard to transform, to transfigure our condition and position as speakers. In a way or another, we have to pass from submission and obedience, what makes of us obedient and disciplined subjects of this despotic master. Any foreign language is a despotic master. And we will try desperately to speak it correctly, and who, of course, never succeed in doing it completely. For us, people in this condition, the use of English is a recourse, a result that is liable, of course, to increase our power to act. That is, it's from Spinoza, puissance d'agir, conatus, vis existendi, in Latin. Of course, it is that. And this is where the core of the problem, that is where the tensions between two poles appear. On the one hand, language, a foreign language, as a master, that is a tyrant, on the one hand. And on the other hand, language, the foreign language, as a vehicle which is needed, and as more than a vehicle, a prosthesis, because a foreign language always is a prosthesis too. It has a prosthetic nature. In the present context, where English has become the shadow, the accompaniment of the Anglo-Saxon hegemony, I would say that we use it as a foreign language. We cannot do without it by taking Prometheus as some sort of a model. We have to learn, we have to speak, we have to write English the same way the Greek Titan stole the fire from the gods. The difference being that we will not be punished. We will not be punished for that. But hopefully we will be rewarded. We will be rewarded. So what we have to acknowledge is this primal constituent tension that exists between the two poles. The availability of English as the new lingua franca and the violence of linguistic supremacism. Linguistic supremacism, it exists, like racial supremacism. An invisible and most of the time unspeakable, impossible to articulate, war rages between these two dimensions of English as global language or idiom of globalization. It's like a civil war, some sort of a civil war, English versus English. And this discord, this dissent, this dispute is what we have to reflect on and try to, let's say, problematize, that is to put words on. What we first have to acknowledge is that an element of violence is omnipresent in the relations between different languages. And this is something each of us has experienced and will again and again in various situations. If children spoke Taiwanese instead of Mandarin at school in the 60s of last century, anywhere in the Republic of China, they were punished. The same way pupils who spoke Breton in Brittany, that is western part of France, in the first decade of the 20th century were punished. Any speaker of a minority language is familiar with these situations and issues. But it's not only that. When you have to speak the lingua franca, who is also the language of hegemony, for an exam or when you apply for a job, it always has something of a test. A test you can pretty well, which can pretty well become some kind of an ordeal. And depending on your proficiency in this language, it's more or less challenging and violent for you as a speaker. In my case, if I have to write something on serious matters, let's say for me, philosophy, which is my racket, something related to my alleged sphere of expertise, I, of course, would rather do it in French than in English. But if I must do it in English, or speak as I do right now, I feel as if I had to swim through a river with my clothes on. This is what I feel. The alacrity, the eagerness, the speed in thinking are like, I would say, impaired or put in chains. So what I would like to stress is that we cannot only adopt the utilitarian viewpoint approach. When we think about English as the lingua franca, we should master for practical reasons. We always have to take into account the political dimension of its hegemony and what makes this hegemony contentious. There is something like a double bind or a vicious circle here. And this is what we have to detect and be vigilant about. Undoubtedly, mastering English increases our capacities. It opens up a whole range of possibilities. For example, for me, just to teach in Taiwan, which I could not do in French, obviously. And to some extent, it even helps expanding one's, let's say in Bergsonian terms, vital power. It doesn't only provide me a good job here in Taiwan, it makes me smarter or, let's say, less narrow-minded by making it possible for me to spend all these years in East Asia rather than as a destitute pensioner in some rat hole in a rural area in France. But on the other hand, when I work in English, it's not only a technical issue, passing from French to English. It's an operation of translation I have to perform, to achieve. An operation which is not only linguistic and which is not basically, primarily linguistic, but before all cultural. It is cultural. For when I work in English, I don't use English. It's not like that. I don't use English. I'm impaired by English, which is very different. Appareillé in French. I'm impaired by English. It's some sort of a mental prosthesis. I have to learn how to work, to think and speak with this prosthesis. The same way you have to learn to walk with a walking frame when you have broken your femur's neck. I have to become familiar with concepts which have no equivalent in my mother tongue and which a priori do not appeal to me. Things like empowerment. What is empowerment in French? Nothing. Doesn't exist. And I would even say it doesn't really make sense, which is worse. Or what? Rock states, boo, rock states, what that? So I could tell you a lot about it and why translation appears here to be such a difficult and risky operation. Put differently, in such a context, you don't appropriate the lingua franca, you don't seize the lingua franca as some sort of a booty. It's just the opposite. It is the lingua franca which takes the upper hand, that is ascendancy over you. And, okay, you might call it in philosophical terms, it's some sort of ruse of not reason, but language here. I refer first to the famous statement by Hegel on the ruse of the reason in history, of reason in history. The important thing here is that we should never lose sight of the fact that when we use a foreign language in a context where cross-cultural relations are at issue, where we have to interact and communicate, argue with people who belong to different cultural contexts, and do it for practical reasons in English, we constantly are in translation. And translation is not primarily a technical matter or a simple matter of level of qualification, fluency, proficiency, etc. It's a matter of transliteration. Transliteration, that is transposition, interpretation. It's a matter of hermeneutics. It's just a matter of hermeneutics. And this is why all this chattering about bilingualism is just for show. It's just an empty claptrap. When I teach a course in English, I cannot prevent from thinking in French. First and persistently, my poor mind sticks to French. It sticks to French because French is my native mental chewing gum. So then I do my best to put that thing thought in French into English, to transcribe it into that damned global language. Because I'm not bilingual. I have that English which is average, passable, acceptable, but it's not being bilingual at all, at all. And the proof of that being that I constantly resort to my beloved dictionary, who is my savior in so many occasions. And in particular, when I have to pass from an idiomatic expression. We think a lot in idiomatic expressions. When I have to pass from an idiomatic expression that spontaneously comes to my mind and find the equivalent in English, it's an ordeal. It's always an ordeal, and have to go to dive into the dictionary, because it's like that. Why do you say in English to call a spade a spade? Doesn't make sense. In French, we say to call a cat a cat. This makes sense, to call a cat, not to spade. What spade? We need a spade in that context. So, and it's always like that. It's always like that. So, and okay, when you listen to my talk, being native English speakers or not, you also constantly have to complete various transcription, transposition operations, that is taking into account my queer accents, my mistakes in pronunciations, my anacolute, looking for chains of equivalence in your own language, etc., etc. So, and I think this is an experience which each of us who is not a native English speaker can make. Yes, it's interesting. We very easily take notice of the typical mistakes the others, the cultural others, do, as the same way they take notice of ours. Because we don't make the same typical mistakes, because the typical mistakes come from our own language, from our native language. For example, I repeatedly am absolutely amazed by the way very well-trained Taiwanese English speakers, Taiwanese people, Taiwanese colleagues who speak English, excellent English, they speak an excellent English, but all of a sudden they mix up he and she. Oh, and I immediately lose the thread. What are they talking about? A man, a woman? I get lost. Immediately I get lost. I'm asking myself, but how is it that these people speaking that beautiful English make such a childish, and more than childish, mistake? And of course, the other way round, when I do talk, they notice when they think, oh, this is typically French. Yes, and so this is how it works. We, for example, when we speak English, French people, we constantly bump into what we call false friends. False friends. That is about the same words, but which have a completely different meaning in French and in English. A good one being, for example, preservative, which is in English food, but which in French means condom, which is not exactly the same. So these four friends are like, I would say, anti-personal minds, which pave our way when we speak English. We bump into one, we don't lose a leg, but we lose face. We lose face. The problem of approximate bilingualism is very, I think, narrowly and constantly related to shame. To shame, because when we make mistakes in the foreign language we are supposed to speak well, we are ashamed. We lose face. When you take notice, always too late, of the fact that you have made a mistake in a conversation, and this in particular in the academic space, you are deeply ashamed. You feel both guilty and ridiculous. And it's important because it shows that in the face of the language you borrow, and you never perfectly master, you are an eternal culprit. You are the objective culprit. and this is, all the realm of imaginary guilt, like in Kafka's famous novel, The Trial, the Process. You have to stand in front of the language. You have to stand in front of the language as K, the character in this novel, stands in front of the law. He stands in front of the law, doesn't knowing at all what the law exactly is, but he has to stand there, the law being an undecipherable apparatus of justice, and he has to wait for the unescapable sentence. It's about the same experience. When you speak a foreign language, you are constantly exposed to the risk, not to be killed, but just to fall back into childhood, talking like a child. Okay, but yes, this is only the tip. In French, we would say the top of the iceberg. Then comes something which is much more intricate, which is translating or making travel that is passing from a cultural realm, world, or system to another. This operation doesn't consist primarily in looking for equivalence. That is, looking for the right word for another, dog for chien in French, chair for chaise. It's much more complex and risky because it's about decoding, recoding. This is where we pass from translation to interpretation. One more example I borrow from my experience as a teacher. Have learned from this experience that when I find recurrently in students' works passages that deal with Foucault's work, and passages in their writings where the Foucault I'm a bit familiar with has become completely unrecognizable. It is not, first of all, a matter of, let's say, good or bad translation. It is more generally a matter of travel. That is how philosophy travels from a continent to another, from a culture to another. It's a matter of circuits, channels, filters, decoding and recoding. It's not only that that is my students, Foucault usually has made a long trip, detour, through the US campuses before reaching the local audience here in East Asia, which also is a detour through English, of course, because they read Foucault in English. It is also that all the founding concepts of this work, Foucault, are rooted in the West European cultural and historical compost, which makes that if you are not familiar with the genealogy of modern forms of power in the West, for example, you might easily get lost and completely lost in translation. When, for example, Foucault puts into circulation a notion like governmentality. I always constantly find governmentality. It's a magic word in the students' work. But they just use it like that because it looks good. But what it means in the Foucaultian context, it's another story. And of course, they cannot be familiar with that. So it's just boop, the magic word. If you are not familiar with the genealogy of liberalism, neoliberalism, as Foucault works on it, you just use it for the show. For for concepts, the travel from a cultural area to another is often an ordeal. At the end of it, they appear to have been twisted, distorted, as if they had survived an earthquake. And this is one example among many others of the challenges we face when we envision translation as a complex operation which consists in making works, theories, concepts, and notions travel from a cultural area to another. This applies to philosophy, social sciences, to, let's say, the life of the mind in general, but as well to art. Of course, we need good translators, considering translation from the technical angle of view. That is, people who have a very intimate knowledge of the language they are translating from into their mother tongue. On this issue, it may surprise you, but my conviction, based on my experience over a decade or two, is that today in Taiwan, really qualified translators into Mandarin for a contemporary philosophical essay written in French, this can be held in a nutshell. 5, 10 people maybe can do it properly, not more today in mainland China, I don't know. But yeah, this is my experience, less than 10, I would say. But this is not the main issue. The main issue is that the really good translator is a middleman, is a ferryman. Let's say he's a ferryman, or woman, of course. His or she is a go-between who keeps an eye on the invisible borders and divides that separate or keep apart different languages, different cultures. That is a fellow or a lady who constantly asks himself or herself not only if the translation is correct from a linguistic viewpoint, but to what extent what he or she transposes into his or her own language makes sense for the coming readers. Does it work? Does it work in the other language? That is, will the new readers, let's say in Mandarin, in Chinese, have an intuition of this or that sentence or statement? Is it really convertible? Is it really transferable? Will it be intelligible in the terms of or according to the patterns of his, her own culture? So in brief, we are in translation, which means that we have to convert relentlessly, not money, but thoughts, notions, statements, patterns, values, opinions, conducts, that is, behaviors. And let me borrow an example from a film, which is a brief scene, which I will show you right now, because I find that it's quite illuminating. It's a good but somehow forgotten film by a Sino-American director whose name is Wayne Wang. And the film is called Chang is Missing. Chang is Missing, which was released in 1982. So it starts with the disappearance of a young man from China, mainland China, who has recently settled down in San Francisco. He has just begun to work as a taxi driver and has disappeared after just a few days after having had a very banal car accident. 2 other taxi drivers, also from Asian descent, are rather in a hurry to find him, to find his track, because they have lent him $4,000 US so that he could pay his car plate, that is license as a taxi driver. And this is where the two guys meet a lady, most probably American-born Chinese, whose job is cultural mediation, which is a very strategic, rather strategic task in a society made of a medley of ethnic, linguistic, religious, and communities. So she explains them that some sort of a misunderstanding happened as the recent Chinese immigrant, not quite fluent in Californian English and not familiar with the local rules and patterns, had to go to the police station to testify about the accident. And as you will see in the clip, it's all a matter of language, of command of English, but not only, and maybe not basically that. Finally, it's a matter of cultural dissent. Cultural dissent it's about the challenges, about the gaps, the failures in the realm of cross-cultural interactions. So, can we see the clip now?
This morning when Steve and I were having breakfast at Chester's, a woman showed up looking for Chun Hong. It was about a car accident he was in.
You see, I'm doing a paper on the legal implications of cross-cultural misunderstanding. And Mr. Chan's case is a perfect example of what I'm trying to expose here. You see, the policeman and Mr. Chan had completely different, culturally related assumptions about what kind of communication each one was using. For instance, the policeman, in an English-speaking mode, asked a direct factual question. They're interested in facts, and that's all. Asked, did you stop at the stop sign? Expected a yes or no answer, simple yes or no answer. Mr. Chan, however, rather than giving him a yes or no answer, began to go into his past driving record, how good it was, the number of years he'd been in the States, all the people that he knew, trying to relate different events or objects or situations to what was happening then, to the action at hand. Now, this is very typical, as I'm sure you know, of most Chinese speakers, trying to relate possibly unrelated objects or seemingly unrelated objects to the matter at hand. The Chinese try to relate points or events or objects that they feel are pertinent to the situation, which may not to anyone else seem directly relevant at the time. At any rate, at this, the policeman became rather impatient. He stated the question, did you or did you not stop at the stop sign, in a rather hostile tone, which in turn flustered Mr. Chan, which caused him to hesitate answering the question, which further enraged the policeman, so that he asked the question again, you didn't stop at the stop sign, did you? In a negative tone, to which Mr. Chan automatically answered, no. Now, to any native speaker of English, no would mean no, I didn't stop at the stop sign. However, to Mr. Chan, no, I didn't stop at the stop sign was not no, I didn't stop at the stop sign. It was no, I didn't not stop at the stop sign. In other words, yes, I did stop at the stop sign. You see what I'm saying? It was correct in the Chinese because the answer has to match the truth of the action. However, English speakers, Native American English speakers, tend to work more from a grammatical mode. Well, to put it in layman's language, English language emphasizes the relationship between grammatical structures. And the Chinese language tends to emphasize the relationship between the listener, the speaker, and the action involved. Well, at any rate, Mr. Chen has to appear in court so we can get this all straightened out, so he can explain everything. And he missed his court date.
When does he have to appear in court?
Our court date was last week. That's why I'm trying to find him. He wasn't there last week.
Tell us about that.
Well, have you seen him? I mean, do you know where I can get a hold of him? Because I've got to make another appointment. We've got to get...
Chun Hong wouldn't run away because of the car accident. But I have a strong feeling something might have happened.
So, I imagine you see why I showed that it's a purple passage of cultural misunderstanding. It's quite funny. Okay, let's go to the end of my talk. So, if we want to take bilingualism as a notion seriously into account, the first thing I think we have to take into consideration is this. Real situations of bilingualism have to be deeply and durably rooted in individual and collective experience. At the level of the individual, the classic example is that of a person who spent his or her childhood in his or her family in a foreign country, speaking, let's say, Chinese or French at home and English at school, and with his or her friends, and then sometimes lives in France or Taiwan, and sometimes in the US or Britain. It's a very special situation. Not many people can enjoy such conditions that make bilingualism possible. At the level of a collectivity, it's an issue I think Taiwanese people are quite familiar with. Bilingualism is inseparable from the history and the cultural background of these countries. Many people in these countries are bi or even trilingual. They pass without even noticing it from Mandarin to Hokklo, Hakka, or some Aboriginal idiom. But if you look carefully at it, you notice that in this very configuration, bilingualism does not mean that the two languages have the same status or are of equivalent condition. Things are much more complicated than that. Mandarin, as far as I know, is the language of the state, which became obligatory as the defeated of the civil war on the mainland withdrew to Taiwan. It has been for decades the only exclusive official language of the state, as Japanese was previously. And this leaves, I imagine, lasting traces. Hokklo, Hakka are the language of the people, of various communities, what people speak at home, what they speak in the street. Even if these vernacular languages have been more recently dignified after the end of the authoritarian system. But they don't play, basically, they don't play in the same league as Mandarin. They are local, as Mandarin is, let's say, global. And to make things even more complicated, people in everyday life constantly mix up, as you know, hybridize. They hybridize Mandarin with Hokklo and other languages the same way people creolize French in the French post-colonies, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyane, La Réunion, etc. So when the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze contrasts what he calls major language and minor language, langue majeure, langue mineure, what he has in sight is not the difference between a language that has many speakers or whose destiny is to become global, like English today, and a language that has only local speakers and whose use is limited to a small area. The difference between major and minor language for him is that a major language sets a model the locutors have to comply with. It is compact, it is restricting, it designs a territory that is static and very often conquering. A minor language, by contrast, is what designs escape or flight lines out of the static, of a static linguistic or cultural space, out of a form of domination. And this is what Deleuze, in his queer vocabulary, calls deterritorialization. It is constantly changing or carried away by this process which Deleuze calls devenir, that is, becoming. I think, as an amateur, of course, from outside, that Hokklo is the perfect example of that. That is a typically minor language in the era of the authoritarian regime, but whose becoming has become uncertain, whose status and regime is changing, are changing, as they tend to become a booty or the hostage of the general operation consisting in promoting Taiwanization against Chineseness. According to Deleuze, a minor language always has to be very close, have a very intimate link with the people. And this also could be a good clue for raising this issue here in Taiwan, in this country. Taiwanese hoklo as the language, let's say, of the street, an idiom for neighbors, versus Mandarin, the language of the institution, of the state. But I know that this approach of the problem relies on extreme simplification. Finally, Deleuze notices that, I quote, "We have to be bilingual, even in one language." What he was, he could only speak French. That is, we have to practice, and this is the important part of the sentence, we have to practice our own language in a minority way. That is turning away from its purely instrumental, academic, and conventional use, opening breaches in the order of discourses, and making of language itself a field of experimentation and creation. So I think that these examples show how intricate this matter is when you begin to look carefully at what bilingualism is in practice, in real conditions. You discover then that it's in fact a maze, it's a jungle, where you lose your orientation. Basically, I think that nobody can be said to be perfectly bilingual. Even if you are completely fluent in two languages, you probably will feel more at ease in one of them, or let's say in a conversation about gardening or car repairing, just depending on where you had to deal with the former or the latter. You will certainly do mental calculation in one or the other of them, but not in both of them. You will spontaneously swear in one of them rather than the other, and your stock of insults will be richer in one of them rather than in the other, etc., etc. So, yes, I have to go to the end, so I skip one paragraph to go to the conclusion with Derrida. Derrida, in a beautiful book, which is an autobiographical reflection on his own condition as a Francophone speaker, a book called The Monolingualism of the Other, capital, or The Prosthesis of Origin. In this book, Jacques Derrida coins this quite amazing sentence. He says, "This language, the only one which I'm doomed to speak as long as I will be able to speak, that is to life and death, the only language you see, this only language you see, because it's some sort of a conversation, will never be mine. I never was to tell the truth. It never was to tell the truth." And further in the book, he insists, quote, "I have only one language, and it is not mine. My own or my proper language is something I cannot assimilate." Why does Derrida say this? First of all, for a very good reason. As he was a child during the Second World War, he and his family were stripped of their French citizenship as Algerian Jews by the then ruling Pétain regime in metropolitan France. This is for him a wound that is still bleeding decades and decades later. It's a trauma that erects an invisible barrier between him as a Francophone and French as the official language of the state that perpetrated the infamy he and his community were the victims of. Then this puts him in the book on the track, of course, of colonization. French in Algeria, and for the Algerians, all of them, Arabs, Berbers, Jews, Europeans, as a colonial language, and as the language of colonization, French as the language whose supremacy repressed and drove back all local languages, beginning with Arabic, of course. And most of the Algerian Jews were Arabophones. As a child, Derrida grew up in a society where he heard people speak different languages and people mixed up these different languages at home, in the streets, in conversations between neighbors, etc. But where French was the language of the master, that is, of the schoolmaster, but of the colonial master as well. When Derrida arrived in Paris as a student after having been accepted in the prestigious École Normale Supérieure, a vital stake for him was to lose his typical Algerian accent when he spoke French, the only language he really mastered. The accent from the other shore of the Mediterranean Sea, that is from the colony, was for him a curse and a stigma he had absolutely to free himself of, and as quickly as possible. Shame again, shame, the stake of shame. This accent, he says in the book, was incompatible in metropolitan France, and in particular in the academic milieu, with the dignity of a public speech. These are his words, the dignity of a public speech. So he had to learn how to speak pure French, a notion which is based on the biases and prejudices you can imagine. The accent is often a sensitive political stake in my country. I remember, but this is it, French-Chinese context. Some years ago, many years ago already, my wife is here, was fired from a Chinese-speaking web TV in Paris because of her Taiwanese accent in Mandarin. But actually it was a pretext. She was fired for political reasons, I would say, but the good pretext was that she spoke Mandarin with that strange, phony Taiwanese accent, and that the people who listened to it and who were from mainland China would not be so happy about it. So accents. Derrida says that he feels lost when he's outside France and French. He taught a lot in the US, but still feeling lost there, because he can only practice other languages in a rather clumsy way. He will never inhabit them, he says. He will not inhabit them, as he does with French, his mother tongue. And then he quotes Hannah Arendt, a very famous interview delivered by Hannah Arendt to a German journalist long time after the war. Hannah Arendt says that for the immigrant, for those who have had to leave their country, the persecuted exiles, it is actually the mother tongue, her mother tongue, which was a substitute for the lost country, Heimat in German. That is, German became her homeland in exile. And Derrida says this, make this comment on that famous statement by Arendt. He says, okay, this makes sense, but maybe one should add something. You never can exclude that this mother, the language, the mother tongue, this language, this mother becomes mad or bad. Mad or bad. Mad or bad. And this is exactly what happened to me when, with my family, I was stripped of my French citizenship. The milk provided by this mother became poison, some sort of a poison. So, okay, we have to take this possibility into consideration. And this is why he adds, I cannot identify without any reservation with this mother tongue. There is a breach, there is a crack, which makes that I cannot be just a natural French speaker, that I feel like some sort of an exilee within the sphere of this language, which in spite of all is mine. So in sum, I think that Derrida's autobiographical reflections on his experience as a French speaker have or can have for us some sort of a paradigmatic value. We cannot think about our relation to language, to any language, exclusively in terms of identity, identification, suitability, proficiency. We also have to see it from the angle of difference, dissent, discord. And this, of course, all the more when we raise issues related to bilingualism, multilingualism. What remains after all is that Babel is our condition. Babel is our condition. It cannot be abolished by decree. It cannot be overcome by decree from above or with just a wave of magic hand. Okay, let's be bilingual in 10 years. My food. And okay, I would say this is maybe what the wizards of bilingualism a la Taiwanese, the Taiwanese way, should be made aware of. And maybe this is our, what we have to do as academic whistleblowers or something like that. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Very much for this Brossat and for your extremely thought-provoking, illuminating as well, and yet accessible talk. I think Professor Brossat actually talks about maybe at least 3 types of bilingualism here. First is this, I'm talking from the last type that Professor Brossat mentioned. The last type is the kind of inborn, the human condition, where we are caught in this babble where we can't really stick to the mother tongue as if naively as if it's the only language, and we need to constantly say to use Deleuze's term, to escape from the mother tongue, and to create a kind of bilingual situation within ourselves, so that we wouldn't be completely stifled by the major language in cultural terms. And also the second kind would be the kind of relatively natural type of bilingualism, which Taiwanese already is. We switch from, like for me, a Holo speaker, switch from Holo and Mandarin and Hakka. People switch often. For the Aboriginal people, especially, they have to switch between completely different languages, unlike ethnic Han Chinese. And the third type, which is the so-called bilingualism by decree, which actually I think never happens in the world yet, because the kind of paradigms that the government upholds is usually former colonial countries. I mean former colonies, Singapore, Ireland, Switzerland. Well, Switzerland is a different. Switzerland is kind of like Taiwan. It's already trilingual or quadrilingual. So when we are facing the prospect of being, sooner or later engulfed in this totally unnatural, bilingualism or bilingualism by decree. We have to think about the issues that we have actually rarely thought about when we talk about bilingualism. That is, okay, above all, for one thing, we're not. Me or Professor Brossat, we're not anti-English here in any sense. But it's just that, to borrow Bob Dylan's lyrics, how much English must a man gulp down? How much English do we have to learn? Not as an individual, as a professor of English, of course, we have to learn as much English as possible, so that we can become the top in our trade. But for the ordinary people, the government policy is aimed at ordinary people, not especially talented people or people who are working in a trade, which English is completely. English is the only or the major idiom, as you said. So, how much English do we have to learn? We're already learning English. Is it necessary that we, elevate this urgency of learning English to a kind of official bilingualism? In other words, turning the nation into a bilingual nation, which is totally different from enhancing English capacity or proficiency on a general level. So, just one last comment by way of an episode which I went through when I was invited to Sri Lanka some years ago for a language summit organized by the British Council. I went there as a representative, the representative from East Asia, because most of them were from South Asia or Middle East. And after my talk, this very progressive Bengali, Bangladeshi feminist, very progressive actually, she told me that she disagreed with me. So she told me this episode about her Chinese friend, a woman who came from a family, a very poor family, where her mother was a garbage collector, But she learned English very hard, very diligently, and became almost a native speaker. And then she, changed the fortune of her family, etc., etc. And she said one thing. She said, because your economy has already blossomed, and we're still backward, and therefore we need English to advance our economy as well as other aspects of our society. But I told her, when Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and now China, when their economy took off, they didn't have much English. So it was the opposite. Maybe in your countries, it was the English which prevented you from, having your economy take off. Because, just imagine if you teach first-year physics in the U.S. In Spanish. Everybody has some Spanish. And you teach teach first-year physics in Spanish. What would be the outcome of their learning results? And in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in India, that was the case. But their general level of English is not as good as, maybe about it's the same as the Americans' English, Spanish. So, but anyway, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. Just one last remark. I think also in response to that lady, we have to teach English is useful. We need to learn some English. But when we teach as educators, when we teach English, we have to teach it critical in cultural terms. Because very often we teach English as if it's a language of a superior culture. So that causes many of the problems that we are facing right now. So thank you very much for joining us, and hope you come back for our other lectures and activities too. Okay, please take a note of our website. Thank you very much.